Good afternoon and welcome to the Shridath Ramphal Centre's Lunchtime Chat on After MC14, the Caribbean in a Shifting Global Trading Order. Now, before I start, allow me to share a little bit about the SRC and what we do here. So the SRC is the Regional Premier Trade Policy Training Institution here in the Caribbean, and we have three pillars, one being training, the other being research, and the other also being outreach. Now, this discussion forms part of our outreach pillar, and today we are here to discuss MC14. Now, earlier this year, the World Trade Organization held its 14th Ministerial Conference in Yaoundé, Cameroon. It was only the second ministerial conference ever held on African soil, but it took place against a backdrop of profound uncertainty, rising unilateral trade sanctions, deepening geopolitical conflict, and a growing sense that the WTO, now just over 3 decades old, is in urgent need of reform. Now that the dust has settled, the questions are sharper than ever. What was actually achieved in Yaoundé? What remains unfinished? And what does the outcome or the lack thereof mean for the future of the multilateral trading system that is changing faster than many expected? These are the questions that our panelists are here to tackle today, and we'll be doing so through a Caribbean lens. I'm delighted to have with us a panel of experts who are uniquely positioned to help us unpack all of this. And at this point in time, I will just give a brief introduction of the panelists. There will be a document placed in the chat where you can see more about the panelists and the work that they do. So first, we are joined by Ambassador Matthew Wilson, and he is Barbados's permanent representative to the WTO and other international organizations in Geneva. We are also joined by Ms. Vashti Gayadeen, and she is the CEO of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce. We are also joined by a representative from CARICOM, the Caribbean community, and he is Mr. Joel Richards, and he is the Director of External Trade at the CARICOM Secretariat. And last, and by no means least, we are joined by my colleague, Alicia Nichols, who is the Junior Research Fellow here at SRC. And as I mentioned before, the document has been placed in the chat, so you can feel free to learn more about the panelists there. Now, I'm going to start off the conversation setting the scene about what exactly happened at MC14. And Ambassador Wilson, I'm going to start with you. For those of us who were not there on the ground or in the room, can you tell us what it was like in those last few days at MC14, especially as it relates to the discussions over reform? Can you give us an idea of what exactly was happening on the ground?
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you to the SRC for having me here, and thank you to all the colleagues from the region who are online. I recognize quite a few names. Listen, before I get into the meat of the question, let me just say that the Caribbean should be very proud of how we positioned ourselves at MC14. We had the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Jamaica as one of the vice chairs of the conference and also leading the discussions on e-commerce. We had the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who was leading the track on investment facilitation for development. We had Barbados chairing the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific States group. We had Guyana through the ambassador as chair of the negotiating group on rules, leading the discussions on fishery subsidies. And of course, we had CARICOM Secretariat, Joel and ASG Wayne McCook, who were there on the ground supporting us. So it was clear that the majority of us in the Caribbean continue to be very invested in the multilateral trading system and in the WTO. Can I just stop there? I see Elizabeth Morgan is complaining about the sound, but Elizabeth has two names there, so the echo may be coming because she may be on twice. I just want to make sure everyone hears us. So as usual, the Caribbean, we all stepped up to the plate, and we delivered and we represented in ways that I feel far outweighed our percentage of global trade, our population, and our small size. So I just want to put that on record that we, your Caribbean delegates, represented you, the citizens of the Caribbean, very well in Yaoundé. Now, that was the good news. Now on to the bad news. I don't think any of us were happy with the outcome from the ministerial. Some have said outright it was a failure. I don't necessarily agree with that. I'll tell you why. We were able to go into the ministerial with two decisions agreed in Geneva. One on small vulnerable economies, and as you know, all Caribbean countries are designated as small vulnerable economies. And this was the second time in a row that the small economies decision was the first decision coming from Geneva to the ministerial. And it was very much the Caribbean, along with our colleagues from Guatemala, who led on this. The second successful outcome, and Joel knows this well because he was leading on these things when he was in Geneva, was one of the so-called agreement-specific proposals. And again, it was some of us in the Caribbean who very much pushed this to the wire to ensure that we got a decision for the ministerial. Now, it's clear that these are not big ticket items, but it's still important to know that there were two decisions of importance to us that we pushed that were able to go into the ministerial successfully. Now, the big ticket items, WTO reform and the e-commerce moratorium and work program. We were not able to deliver ministerial decisions on these, plus other ministerial decisions on LDC issues. And we already knew going into the ministerial that we were not going to have any breakthrough on agriculture or fishery subsidies or the dispute settlement system, or frankly, even delivering on investment facilitation for development. So there were no surprises there. Now, why do I say it was not a failure? This was because in Cameroon, we actually had real negotiations. And we came extremely close to delivering on both of those pillars, the WTO reform and the e-commerce moratorium and work program. On e-commerce, the Jamaican minister was able to put on the table something that the vast majority of us were happy to support eventually. And actually, it was really only two countries at the time, Turkey and Brazil, who had some concerns. And now when we got back to Geneva, Turkey has removed its concerns from the table. And right now, it remains for Brazil to let us know what their position is. Was I surprised by Brazil? I was. Was I disappointed by Brazil? I was. And I still am. But one of the reasons I think I was disappointed is the decisions that we could have taken from the ministerial would have a huge impact on multilateralism. It would have a huge impact on the narrative around the WTO. It would have a huge impact on partnerships moving forward. So for me, what was at stake was more than the sum of its parts. Yeah. That said, looking at the Yaoundé process, you would recall that the US had taken a very maximalist position on the e-commerce moratorium, for example. They just wanted an open-ended moratorium. And we had some countries like India that said they would like to see the moratorium end. And where did we land? Where did we land in Cameroon? We landed with a 4-year extension, plus a possible development package, plus a work program. And frankly, I could not have imagined that we would have gotten anywhere near that result. And this was because of negotiations, give and take, and real dialogue. So for me, that is a success. And I'm hoping that here in Geneva, despite what has happened, with the US, et cetera, having their own paper on e-commerce and the e-commerce plurilateral, that we will still be able to get a multilateral agreement, which reflects what the majority of us were able to coalesce around in Cameroon. Now, on reform, this is a very interesting issue, and we've done an incredible amount of work in Geneva through the facilitator-led process. Has it been perfect? Definitely not. Were there things that many of us would have liked to see included or not included? Of course. But did we make progress? definitely. And I think that needs to be recognized. Frankly, we had the contours of what a future WTO reform discussion would be. And some of the issues that the Caribbean were particularly strong on, such as consensus and the primacy of development, in my estimation, were addressed in a way that should give us comfort. And here again, I want to recognize Joel, who very much led the ACP work on WTO reform before he transitioned to an even more impactful role representing all of CARICOM and not just the OACS. So we went into Yaoundé with a document on WTO reform that, like I said, some were not pleased with, but through true negotiation and bridge building, including very, very late into the night, we were able to agree to a revised reform package that almost everyone, if not everyone, around the table were able to agree to. There were ministers from the US, the EU, UK, India, China, Canada, Barbados, Jamaica, the Gambia, Saudi Arabia, and many more who were around that table late at night negotiating what a landing zone could be, and we were able to get there. Now, this document really tried to balance the need for clarity with the need not to prejudge the outcome of the discussions. But right now, this document is very much in suspended animation, and I hope that we will be able to remove it from the freezer, thaw it out, and shortly begin some work on important elements of WTO reform. Are we where we should be 2 months after the ministerial? Definitely not. And it's unfortunate because this is exactly what we did not want to happen, this lapse in time, this relaxation, this narrative building that the WTO has failed. And if I'm honest, there has been a lack of leadership from some quarters. And on that, I will not get into on record. I'm a huge believer in the role of the Secretariat and the role of the Director General. And I feel that we need to continue to give the Director General space to be able to bring us together, to knock heads together, and at least help us to see certain pathways. And I'm wrapping up now, Vanessa, because the chair of the General Council, Ambassador Kelly from New Zealand, she really is trying to continue the dialogue and to find a path forward. And CARICOM met with her just this morning at 8:30. So the timing of this webinar is great. And we were able to give our views on how we see things moving forward, including that we should continue the discussion on WTO reform from where we ended, and using all that incredible work that we did over the past 8 months as a basis of the discussion, i.e., we are not reopening things we do not want to start again. So I'm really pleased that just a few hours ago, the GC chair sent out a letter to all members asking us to nominate facilitators to restart the reform process and discussions as soon as possible. On the e-commerce moratorium, it's lapsed. The multilateral e-commerce moratorium has lapsed. There is no work program on e-commerce at the WTO right now. And we know, and I'm sure Vashti will reaffirm this, so many of our entrepreneurs are interested in digitalization issues. For them, this is the future. And we are doing ourselves a great disservice by not being able to discuss these issues at the WTO. So we need to find a way to harness and harvest what we agreed in Cameroon by the majority of countries, the 4-year moratorium with a work program, and also a very clear direction for support for developing countries. Even the US agreed to that. So we need to move this discussion forward. So let me stop here with this overarching view of where things led to and where we've landed. The WTO is not dead. If anyone says that, tell them that they're misrepresenting the reality. But it is not running on all cylinders. And small countries like us, frankly, we cannot afford to see the WTO continue to shift gears downward. Well, there's never been a greater need for more multilateral leadership, for more multilateral predictability, and frankly, for more multilateral transparency. So I'll leave it there, Vanessa, and happy to come back later. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador, for aptly summing up what took place on the ground at MC14. You talked about your perspective on what was delivered. You brought to bear the concrete examples of things that would be beneficial for small and vulnerable economies. And you highlighted that, there was a lot that happened, and you were seeing the cup as kind of half full and not looking at it the other way around. So, Mr. Richards, let me bring you in on this as well. Ambassador mentioned you were too on the ground in Yaoundé. So, can you share what were CARICOM's main objectives going into MC14? And did CARICOM coordinate around a common negotiating position? Was there coordination visible? And do you think, if the coordination was there, do you think it paid off?
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and good afternoon to everyone. Good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Thank you for convening this very important forum, and thank you for inviting the CARICOM Secretariat to be a part of this discussion as well. Before I answer your question directly, I want to agree with a point that Matthew made, which was that the ministerial in totality was not a failure. I think that view is out there, but I do not subscribe to that view in its entirety, because I think sometimes people underestimate the important role that the WTO play as a convener and as a deliberative forum for its members to come together and address critical trade policy matters. And MC14 took place in a very difficult context. It took place just after the outbreak of the current war in the Middle East, and there were many voices rising up saying the ministerial should be postponed. We went ahead. Many of us heard the views of the Canadian Prime Minister in Davos in January when he spoke about a fracture in the global international order. And many people are talking about this fragmentation, the rise of economic nationalism, etc. But we were able to convene a very important ministerial conference in the context of these significant global disruptions. And I think that in itself is something that should be recognized. And we need to get away from this idea that at every WTO ministerial conference, there has to be some kind of big bang moment or significant concrete outcome, because sometimes there's value in convening and in deliberating, and that should not be lost on us. Now, directly to your question about CARICOM's coordination, our objectives, etc. I'll start with the coordination, because we do have an obligation in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas to coordinate our external trade policy. And so it was incumbent on the Secretariat to coordinate with the member states ahead of the ministerial conference and at the ministerial conference. From September 2025, that coordinative mechanism kicked into high gear, because we convened our first technical working group meeting with our member states in September 2025, where we started looking at all issues that we felt would be germane to outcomes at the ministerial conference. In November 2025, our trade ministers met, the Council for Trade and Economic Development, and we did have a full and thorough discussion amongst ministers on the preparations for the ministerial conference. And we did receive guidance and instructions from ministers and on the kinds of positions that CARICOM should take on some of the critical issues. I can get into those a little later. In February 2026, just about a month and a half before the conference, we also had a second technical working group meeting of senior trade officials, and not just trade officials, senior officials generally, because on the agenda of the ministerial conference were issues relating to agriculture, electronic commerce. So senior officials with responsibility for these types of topics across member states were brought together. And there we refined CARICOM's positions and views on all matters going to the ministerial, and then in March, on the ground in Yaoundé, we convened a special meeting of the Council for Trade and Economic Development, to further refine our positions. And we received instructions from that special quoted in terms of how we needed to engage in the ministerial itself, what flexibilities we can offer. And if I may just very quickly speak to those, because our objectives really are, we cannot separate our objectives from those decisions that we were given by our ministers. And I think our ministers went into the ministerial very clear that we had to dial back our expectations. It was very, very clear from early. So even December, when there was the December General Council, it was becoming very clear that we were not going to get significant and concrete outcomes on many issues, and that there were many challenges amongst the membership. And so we had to calibrate our expectations. What we wanted to secure at the Ministerial Conference was a decision by WTO ministers on reform, but importantly, a decision that would not prejudice any of CARICOM's fundamental interests. And Matthew mentioned the issue of decision-making by consensus. In November 2025, when our trade ministers met, our trade ministers reaffirmed the importance of decision-making by consensus for CARICOM and rejected any attempts to alter the status quo. And we went in very, very clear on that. But nonetheless, we felt that it was important for ministers to launch a process on reform. We wanted to see the work program on electronic commerce renewed without a sunset clause. But very importantly, we wanted to see the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions renewed. Now, there was a bit of nuance in CARICOM's position there, because we had, as Matthew said, the maximalist position by the United States, which was an indefinite extension of the moratorium. But we were also very conscious that many developing countries felt like they didn't want to give up policy space in that area indefinitely. And so the ACP had a submission which called for a two-year extension, and many other members supported that. But we always felt that we needed to land somewhere in the middle. And our ministers demonstrated sufficient flexibility to go into the conference to say that CARICOM can agree to a period beyond the 2 years. And that gave us enough wiggle room and gave our negotiators sufficient space to show flexibility at the meeting. And of course, we wanted an outcome on agriculture, which is to relaunch the negotiations, and ultimately we didn't get there. And very critically as well, there's an agreement on investment facilitation for development, which 6 CARICOM member states are party to. And we went into that ministerial supportive of that agreement being incorporated into the WTO's legal architecture. And again, we didn't get there, but at least that was one of our objectives. So I'll leave it there for now, and then I'll be happy to come back in on any of these points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richards. So we have some consensus between you and Ambassador on the on the outcomes of MC14. Now I'm going to switch lanes and move to our researcher on the panel, Alicia. I want to get your perspective from a development lens. Were the MC14 outcomes meaningful in terms of development, and do you think that they mostly preserve the status quo, or are you in alignment with the 2 other panelists that would have gone before you?
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And I will say MC14 had very limited development value. I too am not of the opinion that it was necessarily a failure. One of the things I always say is that it was predictably disappointing in terms of the outcomes, particularly when you think about the fact that there was a lot of um, expectation and hope to some extent that some issues would have at least have received some agreement, that there would be some agreement on some issues. So things like the issues concerning the LDC countries, for example, it was a bit disappointing to see that members were not able to agree on a decision on that. And as I was reading through the proposals in the proposed LDC package, there were some interesting things that they raised in that, also in terms of like procedural issues as well that they talked about. So you did have and Ambassador Wilson touched on this, the small economies work program being reaffirmed, which I thought was a good thing. Um, Particularly since that's something that's key to us. LDCs is key to the extent that it's an issue for Haiti, which is the only LDC in CARICOM. But with regard to the small economies issue, I thought it was important, as Ambassador said, to have that reaffirmation, especially given everything that you see going on now and the fact that that small economies will be among the most affected by what is happening. And certainly you saw that with regard to one of the latest IMF reports, which talked about Caribbean oil importing countries will be some of the most impacted by what's happening in the Middle East. So my response to your question, Vanessa, because I know that the time is running slim, is that yes, it had limited development value. It was really more so a reaffirmation of some existing mandates. And I think that I am sympathetic, of course, to the view as well that given the fact that we have this very fractured and fragmented political space right now, the fact that ministers still saw it important to converge in Yaoundé and discuss these issues, I guess we could sort of see that as a win.
Yes, I totally agree with that sentiment because the willingness was there to meet, the willingness was to get there on the ground. So that is also an important factor we need to keep in mind when we're looking at assessing the willingness behind moving forward in terms of things happening at the WTO. Now, I also want to switch and I want to get the private sector perspective. And we have Ms. Bashi Gayadeen on the panel. And I just want to get from her how the outcomes of the WTO not affected, but how do you view them in terms of a private sector perspective? Do you share the same views as the other panelists that have gone before in terms of seeing it as not something that was totally disastrous, or do you share a different view?
Thank you, Vanessa. First and foremost, for business to flourish, there must be a level of predictability. And I have to agree with Ambassador Wilson. We did not see predictability here. And I'm going to talk specifically in terms of the moratorium. Roughly, I'm glad that Vanessa Torrey is on here because roughly just over a year ago at the Trinidad and Tobago's Chamber's annual business meeting, one of our guests was Christine Bliss, who is the president of the Global Coalition of Services. And at that panel discussion, she flagged the issue of the WTO moratorium. And at that point in time, most of the members of the private sector were not aware of this moratorium. So we had to do some education from a chamber's perspective about what this moratorium is about, because this moratorium started in 1998 and most businesses in the region have gotten used to no custom duties on a number of electronic medium. So in doing that, we built an alliance with the coalition and we started negotiating and put forward a position paper. And I actually got because if you go back and you see the agreement that was signed, there were a number of Caribbean chambers as well as the CARICOM private sector organization who was negotiating and part of the position paper. So we had a position and we were on board simply because more than 1/3 of businesses in the region are services firms and we benefit from that moratorium. So hence the reason why we were actively involved. And more so, most of these business support organizations had reached out and they wanted to get a Caribbean perspective on board.
Thank you very much for that. One of the things that was discussed at MC14 was the fishery subsidies agreement. I'm staying with you, Bashti, so you can keep your mic unmuted. And I want to get your perspective on what it's like on the ground for fishermen in terms of their perspectives on the fact that, there's going to be a new way to have businesses go about fishing in terms of government involvement, in terms of subsidizing the industry. So I just want to get your perspective on what it's like in the ground on Trinidad from the fisher folk, from any fish processing entities within Trinidad and Tobago.
That's an excellent question here because about 2 years ago, the Chamber established a food security and fisheries and agriculture committee. So we have been working with fisher folk as well as the agriculture sector. And it's not rocket science because for this industry to be sustainable, you have to put in place a number of sustainable practices. So again, we prepared a position paper and we submitted to our relevant line ministry about our views in this area and why we need to adapt and to put in place a number of incentives for the growth of and sustainability of the sector.
Thank you so much for letting us know about what you guys have been doing on the ground to bring awareness to the need to have more sustainable fisheries. Now I'm going to pivot back to Ambassador Wilson because we just had the private sector perspective from Vashti, and what would you say? You kind of alluded to it when you began, but what would you say to the average man on the ground that wants to know whether or not government should take up money to continue funding the WTO? What would you say to the average person on the ground about the need for the WTO and the relevance of it, given all that is happening?
I mean, it's easy in a way to talk to my Caribbean people because the one thing about Caribbean people is we like to be in the know. We like to have a seat at the table. We like to know what's going on. So extrapolate that to the global level. There is nowhere in this world where you have 166 members sitting around the table speaking about trade, development, and economic issues. Nowhere. There's nowhere where a Barbados can sit next to China and have equal rights in terms of decision-making, voting rights as well on trade and development issues, and have equal space to create, negotiate, adjudicate, to some extent, trade rules and regulations. Vanessa Torre will know this very well, that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. We said that quite a lot last week when Vanessa and I were in Curacao together. And that's exactly it. We have agency, we have influence, we're able to share what the views and perspectives of our island economies are in ways that we probably would not be able to do otherwise. And we're able to engage in trade rules and regulations, but not just rules and regulations, but discussions. Sometimes people think WTO is only about rules and multilateral rules. The amount of discussions we have in the WTO on contemporary issues. Barbados, for example, we chair the MSME working group where we speak about issues of MSME priorities, MSMEs and IP, MSMEs and AI. There's a trade and gender working group. There's a group that talks about fossil fuel subsidies. There's a group that talks about plastics pollution. And this is before we even get to the normal committee work on SPS and TBT and agriculture and TRIPS, which really and truly is the oil that allows trade to function every single day, trade facilitation, for example. So there's no way that we can be some of the most open economies in the world that rely on trade to survive and not be in the largest and most important trade theater globally. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Ambassador. Now I'm going to move on because we talked a bit about the e-commerce moratorium, and I want to go back to Mr. Richards, and I want to ask him about I want him to make it tangible in a way. Tell us what this means for small states, because we were speaking initially before the session started, and we started to talk about some of the things that will be impacted. Can you tell the audience here what are the things you can look to see if impacted if this moratorium does not work in the way that it should?
Thank you, Vanessa. I'll go back in history a little bit. In the event that there's someone who isn't as familiar with the moratorium. So back in 1998, and 1998 is important because that was just before we started seeing the digital economy emerging. So the digital economy we have today, the seeds of that growth were being sown in the 1990s. This is pre-Amazon. This is in terms of the Amazon we know today. This is pre-Apple as we know it today. This is pre this explosion in data as the new engine of the global economy. And so in 1998, in order to assist with this growth in global digital trade, WTO members took a decision that they would not impose customs duties on electronic transmissions. And what we've seen over the years is that things that we used to buy in a physical form, such as you go to the video store to rent a movie, or you go to the music store to buy music, all of those things are now downloadable. All of those things you can access on virtual platforms. That is very significant, especially for our creatives in the region, our content creators, etc. So the Carnival music producers in Trinidad and Tobago, in Barbados, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines can rely on these platforms to reach a global audience. The idea is that if you were to impose customs duties on these types of digital products, it could create massive disincentives on the part of consumers to access these types of products. And so the idea behind this decision to impose a moratorium on applying those duties on these types of digital goods is that you wanted to create space for these industries to grow without being encumbered by by customs duties. And so theoretically, with the loss of the moratorium, albeit and hopefully temporarily, there's that loss of legal certainty, because it now means that countries are no longer bound to abide by the 1998 decision not to impose those types of duties. So theoretically, that is what we're dealing with. But we have to move beyond the theoretical and we have to look at the practical. Because one of the good things, if there is a good thing at all, post the Ministerial Conference, is that nobody has rushed to impose duties on electronic transmissions. And there's a reason why that is the case, because we have to look at the feasibility of doing that. We have not had a practice since 1998 of imposing those types of duties. So one issue is that our customs administrations, not just in the Caribbean and in developing countries, but across the world, customs administrations are not configured to be able to put very complicated systems in place to collect those types of duties. Because is it that you're going to say to consumers that for every download that you make in the Apple Store, for every text message that you send, for every time you go on Spotify, that we're going to find some kind of platform to be able to impose a customs duty on you, right? So there are lots of practical complications which are tied up in whether or not a country is able to do that. And many of us in bilateral trade agreements have made commitments not to impose those types of duties. For instance, in the economic partnership agreement that the Caribbean countries, including CARICOM and the Dominican Republic, signed with the European Union, we have a commitment, a legal commitment in that instrument, not to impose those types of duties. The United States, in its regional trade agreements of late, has also been imposing those commitments on its trading partners. So the good thing is that nobody is rushing to do it, but that doesn't mean that the legal certainty is of no value. And that is why it's so critical to get back to the table and to come back to that decision and to have that decision in place so that it doesn't give any, so that loss of legal coverage is a problem. And Vashti made the point earlier, certainty is very critical to businesses. And that's one of the significant roles that the WTO has played since its founding, is that its legal architecture has provided certainty and predictability in terms of what countries can expect in their normal course of commercial dealings. And that's something that we need to restore on firm footing. Thanks.
Thank you for making that so tangible. I think everyone has an appreciation for what stands to be lost if we don't reach an agreement on this matter soon. I'm going to stick on e-commerce and I'm going to switch to Alicia, and I'm going to answer about her perspective on the plurilateral nature of the WTO, the seeming shift towards plurilateralism and away from multilateralism. I want to get your take on that. Do you see this as a problem, particularly for small states, or do you see it as something that can work to our benefit? What are your views on this?
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And one of the things I would make clear is that even though the WTO is a multilateral organization, it does make provision for plurilateral agreements. And one of the reasons why you're seeing, I will say, greater interest in plurilateral agreements, bearing in mind that there are already two plurilateral agreements within the WTO's architecture under Annex 4, is that you have an organization now which is 166 members, which makes decisions based on consensus. Both Joel and Ambassador would have spoken about the consensus issue already, so I wouldn't really get into that other than to say that because you have these 166 members, all with varying interests, national interests, all seeking to satisfy the interests of their various constituents, it is often difficult sometimes to get agreement on certain issues. And you certainly see that with regard to past mandates where there've not been sufficient consensus in order to get agreement on certain things. And you see that now with emerging issues such as with the issue with regard to e-commerce. So having that variable geometry where members move, not every member moves at the same pace, but members move at the pace where they think it's easier, might help stymie some of the paralysis or stop some of the paralysis and the deadlock that you're seeing. At the same time, I do understand that there are indeed risks. So, for instance, small states might lack the negotiating capacity to participate fully in all of the different plurilateral negotiations going on at once. Then there's also the practical aspect of it. What states tend to do is that they might condition their acceptance of something in one area based on something in another. So they might agree to a position in services or in agriculture, for instance, with the condition that they will get some sort of flexibility or something in another negotiating arena. And if you have plurilateral negotiations, it's not as easy to do that. Another thing is that there is the concern that those states which are not ready yet to participate in a particular plurilateral might find themselves, if, as it was said before, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, they may feel as though if I do not participate in these negotiations, then when these rules are fully negotiated, I would not have had any input into these. So sometimes states might feel compelled to join the discussions just so that they aren't left behind, even though they're not completely ready or may not completely have the capacity at that time to participate in the negotiations. And of course, there's also the view that having increased plurilaterals could fragment the multilateral system. So weaken, if they're not done well, weaken the whole MFN principle. And that's another discussion because something like MFN, which was thought to be one of the core principles undergirding the WTO, you have some states now talking about there's need to relook that. But what I would say, Vanessa, is that there are risks and there are benefits to this greater shift towards plurilaterals. What I would say though is that the plurilaterals, at least, they give us the opportunity to be at the table if we so choose, as opposed to some of the FTAs, which obviously take place outside of the WTO arena, where we wouldn't be part of the negotiation. So the fact that states still see the need, even though they're not getting movement on the multilateral track, they might do it on the plurilateral track within the WTO. That is still somewhat beneficial to us than if they go completely outside of the WTO and do it on a bilateral manner. But one last thing I would say, Vanessa, that I think needs to be reiterated is the fact that you still have countries, I think there are about 27 countries, 20 something countries, thereabouts, which are still seeking accession, Curacao being one of them. The fact that you still have countries that are interested in being a part of the WTO and are actively working towards WTO membership should reiterate to us the fact that the WTO still has value.
True. Very, very true. There are states that are still seeking to become a member of the club, and they are not seeking to be a part of the WTO just because, but there are obvious benefits to being within membership, to being part of the discussions, and being a part of a conversation that will affect the lives and livelihoods of citizens of each state that wishes to join. So I really like that part, and it resonates with me on a practical and tangible level. Now, if I could just ask each panelist to give what they would like to see happening in Geneva on the ground, working towards the next MC14. I'm going to invite you to do so at this time, as well as give your wrapping up remarks so that we can move into the Q&A and get the audience to join in part of the conversation. So I will start with Mr. Richards. I'll start with you first, then we'll go to Ambassador, and we'll come right down.
Well, thank you, Vanessa. And the truth is, I think some of that work is happening already. It's important for members to keep the conversation going. There are lots of divides. There are various positions on different issues. So we have to find a way to bridge the gaps that currently exist. One way of doing that is by open dialogue, frank conversations, but ensuring that WTO processes remain transparent, they remain inclusive. And sometimes we say these things, and when I was in Geneva, these are things that I said very often. And if I may just share a story very quickly, because there's a former US ambassador who, when she departed Geneva, wrote an op-ed, and she said she couldn't understand why countries came into the council room and consistently spoke about transparency and inclusivity, almost as if it were a broken record. But there's a reason why we say that, because if processes are not transparent and inclusive and open, then you don't have trust. And trust is an essential ingredient to get to the decisions that you need to get to. And so that's why it's so important that the way that members conduct themselves in Geneva between now and the next conference is done in an atmosphere that breeds trust. And hopefully that can help to get to some of to at least resolve some of the more contentious issues which we are seeing. It may sound idealistic, but it's something that's very practical and from my experience there. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Ambassador, your perspective?
Okay, here's my wish list: that we would conclude the fishery subsidies negotiations and we would have Fish 2, that we would have investment facilitation for development concluded and anchored within the WTO, that we would have agreement on an e-commerce moratorium that would be 4 years, that we would have made some kind of movement on agriculture, which means doing things differently, because we've been doing the same thing and getting nowhere and still feel we can do the same thing and get somewhere. That we would have a recommitment to aid for trade. As you know, 2025 had the lowest ODA on record. So I'd love to see a recommitment to the fact that technical assistance and capacity building is good for everyone, including to build strong investment regimes. And here, I would also like to see a more realistic approach to the dispute settlement system, including the appellate body. The US, for example, has been very clear that they're not going back to what was there before. We need to really put our heads together and try to figure out what kind of approach we can have that will be acceptable to all to in some way reclaim this really important pillar of the WTO. And then finally, and this one actually is the most important one for me, I would like the positions of developing countries in Geneva, including on issues of SDT and development and policy space and priorities, to be truly informed by discussions and evidence from capital. That means having at the capital level, the policymakers and the private sectors being able to sit together and determine what is the best trade policy for our economies today and in the future, and for this information to be very clearly be in the pocket of the negotiators. Because Joel talked about trust. There's another aspect to trust, and that is when you have confidence in your position, when you have the evidence to back up your position and your argument, that gives you the ability to interact and to interface. And I believe that that's a really necessary part of building a WTO that also works for developing countries, that we have the evidence and the ammunition to really go out there and negotiate what we need and what we deserve. Thanks.
Thank you. Vashti, I'm going to pivot over to you.
Sure.
What would be, well, we know you want to see momentum on the moratorium and such like, but what else would you like to see specifically? I'm going to bring to the table the fact that the SPS, there has been movement in terms of consideration for developing countries in terms of the SPS agreement, that is sanitary and phytosanitary standards for those who don't know. And this is a big thing for businesses I can speak to here in Barbados, and not sure if the same applies, but what would you like to see in terms of that? What would you like to see in terms of the overall momentum towards the next MC?
Sure. So building on what Joel said, because Joel really did a good job in terms of the tangibles and what Ambassador said about the evidence. So I'm going to pull 3 or 4 points, because I said we prepared a position paper, that is the Caribbean Chambers working together with the Global Coalition. And the moratorium is critical simply because it demonstrates that firms have been adopting digital tools to become more competitive, more productive. And most of these firms, the firms that I'm speaking about, the moratorium is not about big tech. It is about micro and small and medium-sized enterprises. So basically, every additional barrier that is imposed on digital trade is effectively a tax on Caribbean entrepreneurs. And Alicia asked me, did you do any studies? And we were able to compile some to do some polls, quick polls, because was what we needed to do right away. And we even had a couple animators present their case studies that they became competitive, and they were able to export their services as a result of the moratorium. So these are stories that, as business support organizations, because I started off saying that most businesses did not understand what custom duties were going to be impacted on in their industries, because these were businesses that started in 2006. So there was no moratorium, any duties on their business. So these are the stories that we need to tell, and the business support organization, hence the reason why most people ask, what is the value of being a member of a chamber? And this is where we advocate on your behalf. So again, the moratorium is critical, and we'll continue to work in that area. And we need to have more sessions like this to drill down deeper And agriculture is critical to us. This is an area that we want to build our competitiveness. So SPS is critical in terms of standards and quality. The Trinidad and Tobago Chamber has been working with the CPSO. In fact, the CPSO have a committee devoted to these issues, and we will continue to negotiate and ensure that it is a priority across the board.
Thank you, Vashti. We'll now move to my colleague, Alicia. Can I have your final thoughts on what you'd like to see moving towards MC15 and your perspectives on anything else that would have stood out to you in terms of what happened on the ground in Yaoundé?
Okay, thank you so much, Vanessa. So I was in Yaoundé, sorry, but I was there for the Trade and Sustainability Hub by IISD, and development issues were the main issues that were discussed because obviously that's IISD's mandate. And one of the things, as I was thinking about this panel, was that the WTO, yes, we see that we are in a period right now of flux, but the fact is, and it bears reiterating that this is not the first time that the WTO has faced seeming failure. There have been previous ministerial conferences that have ended less than spectacularly good. Cancun comes to mind, for example. So we cannot just look at Yaoundé and think that, okay, the WTO is a failure, the WTO is no longer relevant to the Caribbean. I think what this current moment shows is that the WTO is even more relevant now, given everything that's going on. The WTO is an important convener for discussions. For me, as an academic, as a researcher, I rely a lot on WTO data, WTO analysis for a lot of the work that I do. And I'm sure that many of our small states, their small trade ministries, etc., also use the resources of the WTO. So the WTO is important. Now, since we're talking about wish lists, I have my own list of goodies that I would love to see. One is that WTO must not dilute core protections for small economies. And so I say beware of the reform wolf in sheep's clothing, so to speak. I don't want us to be so caught up on the need to make things better that we give away a lot of the rights that we fought for, like things like special differential treatment, etc. And I think that could be a webinar all on its own. Second, we must grapple with newer issues, but also insist that some of the legacy issues from past mandates are developed. So things like agriculture, the additional disciplines under the fishery subsidies discussions, digital trade, food security, among other things, have to be part of the development conversation. We need to continue pooling resources. So CARICOM, they have their ambassadors caucus in Geneva, which is very important. And as we heard here, there's strong coalition building with other other negotiating groups that we're part of in the WTO, like ACP, G90, etc., small vulnerable economies. And that's important for us to ensure that the organization continues to take into account our interests. Fourthly, I think that, and not to ruffle any feathers, but it has to be said, we need greater transparency around national and regional positions in the WTO negotiations. I think it is absolutely unacceptable that I can go online, I could find statements with regard to the USA's position, the EU's position, the UK's position, all of the countries' positions, but I cannot find CARICOM. I cannot find some of our country's positions on issues that they're representing us. We taxpayers, they're representing us, and I do not see anything which says what our issues are online. I think that's something that needs to be dealt with. We need to know what it is that our negotiators are out there doing, what statements they're putting forward on our behalf. Fifthly, we need to rely more on our own analytical capacity. I think that institutions like UE, and particularly SRC, can support Caribbean negotiators with regard to certain things. So legal analysis, economic modeling, policy briefs, especially on some of these newer areas. I think SRC needs to be engaged more. And there's a lot that we can do to assist our region and our governments with regard to these issues that we're dealing with. So with that, Chair, I rest my case.
Thank you, Alicia, especially for putting the plug about SRC, because we are here and we are ready to work, we are ready to serve, and we're ready to help the region in terms of whatever needs they have from a trade perspective. So thank you very much for including your wish list as well as putting in the plug for the SRC. Now it is 2 o'clock on the dot, and I'm going to ask the panelists to stay just 5 minutes more so we can entertain some of the questions from the chat. So we had a question earlier, and the individual, I'm just searching, the individual was asking about the SPS agreement and wanting to hear more on it. I think Vashti would have touched on it, and I would just like to throw it out there and let any of the other panelists who would not have addressed it to add their voice to the conversation. What is the SPS initiative that happened that was highlighted as an outcome at the MC14? What are the benefits for small and developing countries? If you could put your perspective on that, that would be greatly appreciated.
Anyone could jump in, Vanessa?
Yes, anyone.
Okay, so thank you so much for that question. It's mainly a procedural decision. Because one of the things that developing countries have constantly argued is that a lot of the provisions which allow for special and differential treatment, which is basically just flexibilities for developing countries in trade agreements and decisions, etc., is that they're very vaguely drafted, broadly drafted, and it's difficult to operationalize them. So, and especially when you have very technical areas like sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade, etc., it's important to ensure that you operationalize these, you make them more precise, more effective, so that developing countries can use them as they implement these agreements, right? So to answer the question, it was a procedural decision to my mind, basically to continue work on ensuring that these provisions are a lot more meaningful for developing countries.
Thank you for that, Alicia. We have a question in the chat from Alexandra Koval, and this is directed specifically to Ambassador. So they are asking your perspective on how would there be movement in terms of agriculture. They're saying that this is something you would have mentioned before, and they're also asking which countries are participating in the agricultural conversations at the WTO. And they're also asking, how do you see the role of China? I'm not sure if this is related to the agricultural conversation, but that's the question that we have posed in the chat.
Yeah, on agriculture, I would just say that the negotiations really have not matured in the last couple of years, primarily because countries are not willing to untwine is that word, unknot these linkages. And I think in a way, Alicia was talking about linkages, when this fear of linkages when you're looking at plurilaterals as well. But this has been happening in the agriculture negotiations for ages. Instead of us just trying to work on something and finish it, this delegation will say, well, we don't want to do this because this one has to be negotiated first, and that one has to be negotiated first. And then we end up doing nothing at all. While you see that our economies, for example, are becoming more and more food insecure every single day, including because of climate change, including because of a ridiculous amount of agriculture subsidies, including in Europe. And I say this knowing that my colleague from the EU is online listening in to this webinar. So there are a lot of things I think we need to look at. But the most important thing right now is we need to change how we negotiate the agriculture discussions because it hasn't been working. Jamaica played a very important part in the agriculture negotiations recently by putting forward a paper that they saw as a possible ministerial decision landing zone. And a number of Caribbean countries, if not all of us, were very much supporting that approach as well. So the Caribbean is very much involved in the agriculture negotiations. On China, again, we could take a whole webinar to talk about China's positions. What I will say is that publicly, China has been very clear about their support for multilateralism, their support for the WTO, their concern about issues around erosion of the MFN principle and the overuse of the national security exemption. That said, if you listen to the US and the EU and some other countries, it's clear that they are not happy with China's level of notification, of transparency, and the perceived use of government interventions to push competitiveness in China. And I shall leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I have one final question, and this question is from Rihanna Green, and she is saying MC14 produced no progress on restoring the WTO's appellate body. Without a functioning dispute mechanism, how credible is the WTO as an enforcer of multilateral trade rules? And that is, to my mind, a very important question, and I'm sure it's a question that is on the minds of many. So I'm going to put this question towards Mr. Richards and ask his perspective on the question.
Yeah. And thanks to Rihanna for a very good question as well. What I would say is that the dispute settlement function is but one function of the WTO. There's the monitoring and transparency function, there's the rulemaking function, there's the deliberative function, and of course the dispute settlement aspect of it is critical. But it has not collapsed in its entirety. What has collapsed is the appellate body, which is the second tier, or if you were looking at it in the context of a domestic system, we have the lower courts and the high courts are an appellate court. So that is what is not functioning, that second tier. Members are still engaging in the WTO's dispute settlement system. They're still consulting. They're still bringing matters before panels. And of course, a subset of members through the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement, the MPIA, which Barbados recently signed on to, have also made a commitment amongst themselves to use that facility as the second stage beyond the panel stage, so that we are not simply appealing into the void. But it is nonetheless, very good question, because nonetheless, it is very critical for that dispute settlement mechanism to be fully restored. Restoration could be a one-tier system. It could go back to a two-tier system. But without clarity on the nature of the system, then it creates difficulties for members, especially for such a critical element of the WTO. So it is very important that we get back to the table, but this is also victim of broader geopolitical contestations as well. The United States is very clear that we are not going back to the system that we had before, and it continues to block the reappointment of appellate body members, and it continues to indicate that it is not yet ready. And especially under the current administration, chances are we're not going to go back to those negotiations within the next 3 to 4 years. That's just the reality of the situation.
Thank you for that response. And there you have it. We are pleased to have brought you this panel discussion looking at MC14 from a small state perspective, looking at how small states like those in the Caribbean really would navigate the trade space in terms of all the instability and turmoil that is happening. You've heard from our panelists today that there is hope. All hope is not lost. There were benefits, there were outcomes that came out of the MC14, albeit everybody does not see it that way. But what you heard today is consensus on the possibilities of the WTO, the relevance of it, how it still remains relevant. And we want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who joined online, who will listen to the recording, for coming out and participating in the discussion. We thank you very much for your questions in the chat. Of course, I need to thank my SRC team here, everyone who contributed, as well as the IT team here on campus. And I'm going to bid you farewell now, and you can stay tuned. We'll be having another lunchtime chat at the end of the month, and this lunchtime chat will be dealing with SMEs, and we are going to look at the youth and how they are faring in terms of trade. So thank you, and we will close the session off now. Have a good afternoon. Bye.